the executive branch is the president, and he has a right to, use the laws that are on the books and to use his executive power to exercise those powers. It's not a judge's place to try to stop a plane filled with, illegal criminals, returning them back to their home country that are in the country illegally. That's not the judge's job. And that decision will be turned around in a second.
Do you agree with that Donald Trump decision about the citizenship after the birth? So do you ever feel that the laws is biased against the races, class, and the background?
If I am holding a phone, I'm in actual possession of it. If I put the phone down, I don't know if it's yours or it's mine, but it could be either one of us, but we know it's a phone and we could use it if we had to. So that's called constructive possession. So
why every state has a different laws for that? So in Colorado, the drugs are illegal. The drugs are allowed. Why in the different state it is not allowed? Do you think that it is a flaws in the law system? Sudiksha konanki, that the Indian girl was missing from that beach?
Yes, the judge originally gave him 60 years, 30 years without parole, and ultimately that sentence was appealed and it was reduced to 40 years, 20 years without parole. So he was sentenced to 40 years. Well, that perpetrator, the same individual that committed these horrible offenses, he went to prison, and within 6 months, I believe he was killed. He was beaten to death in the prison system.
Oh my God.
And when I say it was the killing of MM and death by prison, MM was the victim in the case, the young woman that was coming out of the health club. She was traumatized by these events, and she never really got over it. And she became addicted to drugs and ultimately died of a drug overdose.
So there will be no any way the people who doesn't have enough money to hire any prosecutor or the attorney, any police officer pull over you. So what are the steps or what are the advice that you can give the people? What should they do and what are their rights?
Okay, well, there's several layers to that question. I don't care if he's Donald Trump or he's Donald Duck. We're all the same. We're all guaranteed protections. And when I see a court or a judge that should have recused themselves, in other words, if they have some interest in the case or the outcome of the case, it's their responsibility and their obligation to come forward and say, I can't handle this case. It should go to someone else.
Fully fair, or is it designed to break the people? Today on the Samir Show, we are pulling back the curtain with the James Porfido, an attorney with over 35 years of experience as both a state prosecutor and a criminal defense lawyer. From the intense pressure of the prosecuting sex crime and the homicide to defending those facing the full force of legal system, James has seen it all. He is also an author of Unequal Justice, the search for the truth to balance the scales. A bold expose on how the system often favors the powerful, leaving the accused fighting an uphill battle. Why you should watch this podcast? Is justice really served, or is it just a game or winning and losing? Are the prosecutor more focused on conviction than the truth? How often does the misconduct happen and who holds them accountable? And what can be done to fix the system so many believe is broken? We are diving into uncomfortable truth most people don't talk about. So stay with us and watch it till the end for the insight that might just change how you view justice. And if you find this conversation valuable, make sure you like, share and subscribe to The Samir Show. Hello James, welcome to The Samir Show. Hope you are doing well.
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and good evening to you.
Yeah, good evening and thank you for being here. It's really glad to have, and every people wanted to know about the laws in the US, either for the US citizens or for the green card holders or for the immigrants people. So it would be a great, I have some questions that I'm gonna ask. So it definitely helped my people to have the knowledge about the laws and everything. And definitely we would like to know more first about your book, Unequal Justice. So can you just brief about yourself, your background, what you are doing,
Of
and
course.
about your book, Unequal Justice? What is it all about?
Okay, so this is the book, Unequal Justice. This is, if you can see the cover. So the book is really a product of my 35 years of experience as an attorney. The title of the book is Unequal Justice, The Search for Truth to Balance the Scales. And if you look at the image of Lady Justice, she's blindfolded.
Correct.
And she's holding scales of justice, which are supposed to be evenly balanced, and she's not supposed to be peeking out from underneath the blindfold. In this picture, she's peeking out from under the blindfold, and she's not balanced with the scales. So what had happened was, after many years of my career, I started out as a prosecutor. I was the head of sex crimes and child abuse and vehicular homicide prosecutions for the state of New Jersey. And ultimately, I became a certified criminal trial attorney by the Supreme Court of New Jersey in 1995. And then I started out in the defense world. I became a defense attorney. I started with a family firm. And after that short time, I started my own practice. And I closed my practice in 2023 in December, and I became affiliated with a firm of counsel, what we call of counsel. It's a good sized firm. We have about 50 attorneys, and I am consulting and available in the criminal section of that firm. The name of the firm is Einhorn, Barbarito, Frost, Botwinick, Nunn, and Musmano.
Okay.
And so we're a well-rounded firm. We deal with all different issues of law, but ultimately, as I handled defense cases from the defense side of the courtroom, being on the other side of the courtroom, moving from one counsel table to the other counsel table, I noticed that the scales of justice were not evenly tipped. Okay. I felt that there were a lot of unfair prejudices, or that the court almost seemed to be predisposed to want to believe the prosecution. And instead of my clients being presumed to be innocent, I felt that they were guilty, and I had to prove that they were not guilty, which is not the burden of a defense attorney under our Constitution. The law really provides for a presumption of innocence. That means the state, the prosecution, needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt each and every aspect or element of the offense to find someone guilty. So ultimately, my book is about those experiences, being a prosecutor and then becoming a criminal defense attorney and handling high-profile cases in that time frame, both from a prosecution side and from the defense side. I also am a TV legal analyst. I've been on TV for probably about 17, 18 years, commenting on a lot of high-profile cases that gain national publicity in the media. Some of the cases which you may recognize, like O.J. Simpson, the Menendez brothers, the Peterson case, Scott Peterson, Robert Blake, Phil Spector, Harvey Weinstein. There were so many cases over the years that I gave commentary on. And then ultimately, I am teaching as an adjunct professor at Seton Hall University School of Law, where I teach persuasion and advocacy, which is really the anatomy of a trial, really talking about how to try a case, an opening statement, direct examination, introduction of exhibits, cross-examination of witnesses, and ultimately a summation, effective argument to a jury at the end of the case. So I really had a very diverse background, as you can hear from my experiences, and ultimately the book wrote itself, in my opinion. The people that were involved in the cases and the lives that were affected ultimately wrote the book for me, I think. It was a work in progress for some time. It was always there. I always had a book in my mind, and the cases really were stories unto themselves, and that's how I wrote the book. And then when I became a defense attorney, it became more apparent to me what the book would be about, because I felt that the scales of justice had truly moved in a different direction.
Okay. So can you just tell me that what is the difference between the prosecutor and the defense attorney? That is, I'm asking because the people who doesn't know about the laws or anything, how the system works. So that's why it's a technical word at your side. So can you brief about that one?
Sure. So the The way it works is like if you're charged with a crime by, let's say, your police department, they have to establish something, a very low threshold to charge somebody. The legal basis to charge someone is called probable cause.
Okay.
Probably the event occurred, the crime occurred, and probably you, as the individual that's been charged, committed the crime. Doesn't require a whole lot of evidence. That's a very low standard. As the case develops through the system, depending on the gravity of the charges or the degree of the charges, and most states treat this system pretty much the same way, the way it goes through the court system. You'd ultimately have a right to a trial, which our Constitution provides under the Sixth Amendment. We have a right to a jury trial. We have a right to confront our accusers. And you have a right to counsel. Those are all guaranteed rights under the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution. And the role of a good attorney for the accused, someone accused of a crime, is to make sure that they're properly represented. And that means to hold the prosecution to the burden of proof that they have. Now, the burden of proof I spoke about earlier, probable cause, enough evidence to charge someone, is not the same standard. When you go to a trial, either a bench trial with a judge or a jury trial with a full-blown jury, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what the standard is required under the law. And the prosecutor must establish the proof, the elements of the offense through the evidence. And the defense attorney must challenge that evidence on several levels. There may be constitutional issues. For instance, if someone gave a statement to the police and they were not properly Mirandized. Mirandized is that there's a law, it's under our Fifth Amendment, you have a right against self-incrimination. That was the result of a case in 1964, Miranda versus Arizona versus Miranda.
Okay.
And that case really codified, made it clear that if you are brought in for questioning regarding an incident to the police station, you are subject to an advisement of rights. You have the right to remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. These are guaranteed rights. It's not just words that you hear on TV when someone gets arrested. They mean something. So if the police violate those rights, any statements you make are subject to what's called suppression. They can be kept out of evidence. You could admit you committed the crime, but if the police didn't properly Mirandize you or advise you of your constitutional rights, those statements could be suppressed.
Okay.
So there's also other issues involving searches, like if there's a search and there's no warrant or it's a warrantless search, the police may seize evidence. Well, the evidence has to be properly seized, either pursuant to a warrant or based upon an exception to a warrant, which there are several. And if that was not done, then you can challenge that evidence coming into the case. Okay. And that is called a suppression motion. So you have a right to suppress evidence. So those rights are guaranteed in our Constitution. And the role of a good, competent, capable defense attorney is to evaluate what that evidence is and to look at it closely and determine whether or not things were done properly.
So what are the qualities that the people should find in the defense attorney? The question is that why should we choose you? Sometimes that many times it happens that it's difficult to choose the exact attorney, that this is the perfect attorney for me, who can save my life.
Right.
So what are the qualities that we can find in that?
Well, that's great. That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Because, I often would tell people, potential clients that came to me, and they would ask me all the wrong questions, in my opinion, like, how much do you charge to do this? And I'd say, well, is that really what you want to know? What do you want to know about my experience? Do you want to know about my background? Do you want to know about how many times I've handled these types of cases? Whether I've been in front of this particular judge or whether I've dealt with this prosecutor. Those are important questions to be asking me. The first question I would not be asking is, well, how much are you going to charge? Because I would say to people, look, if you went to a brain surgeon and they were doing surgery on your brain, are you going to ask them how much you're going to charge me? Or are you going to want to have the most competent and capable qualified person. I said, that's really what the goal is, to have and be comfortable. You should be able to speak to that person and have a conversation. It's a give and take. I always viewed my role as an attorney for the defense or prosecutor to educate either the victim in the case or my client. What is the system all about? What is going to happen in the system? What are we doing in court? What's going to be going on? And I think that's the role of a good attorney, is to be a teacher, to explain to your client, because most people don't know. This is it's like a foreign language. You come into court, you get charged with a crime. Now what happens?
Right.
And that's what the job of the attorney is, to explain that process and to walk you through that and make sure you understand exactly what's happening each step of the way.
Okay. So after you became a lawyer, that in your first case, I think as far as I know, that verdict came within the 10 minutes, right? That was, I think, cocaine case, right?
Yes.
So can you just brief about that? What was all and how was your experience first time that you won the case?
Sure. So yeah, that was my first jury trial, and it involved a vial of cocaine, which was probably, if you can see my fingers, this big.
Oh, okay.
So, I had one person in the car charged, and there were 4 other people in the car that were not charged.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was a very difficult case, and I really just wanted to go to court, and I wanted to be able to pick a jury and have that experience of being in front of a jury, telling the story, presenting the evidence. Mm-hmm. And it was going to be my first event or trial. So, I wanted very much to get into court. So someone had this case that was, one of the prosecutors, and said, hey, you can have this file, go on over to court. You're going to pick a jury. And I didn't know anything about it, but it was a learning scale. I had to learn as I went. So, I guess the moment that I knew that I was going to lose the case was in my summation, because I was holding the evidence in my hand, the vial of cocaine that I had used in evidence to present. And I was trying to argue the law, and the law is, actual possession. If I am holding a phone, I'm in actual possession of it. If I put the phone down, I don't know if it's yours or it's mine, but it could be either one of us, but we know it's a phone and we could use it if we had to. So that's called constructive possession. So I was trying to make an argument using a legal standard, using constructive possession. So I tossed the vial of cocaine out of my hand, and I was trying to argue to the jury that, now you all could own it, technically, because it's constructively possessed by us all. If we know that it's cocaine and we all have access to it, we could technically be charged with being in possession of it. Well, the problem was that the vial left my hand and you couldn't see it. It was gone. So, within 10 minutes, the jury came back and they said not guilty. And it was the right verdict. It really was, because looking back, it was a good learning example for me, what to do, what not to do. And I learned from another demonstration I did in the courtroom that it's not always good to do that demonstration in the presence of a jury. You should try it first.
Right.
But that was the right verdict, because, honestly, I don't know if it was this individual's cocaine. It could very well have been one of the other 4 people that were in the car that just didn't get charged. So, I didn't view this as the end of the day. It wasn't like, I don't want to say it wasn't a significant crime. It was a crime, but in the big scheme of things and the things that I handled later on in the prosecutor's office and as a defense attorney, it wasn't the crime of the century, let's say.
Yeah, that's a really great argument that you had. Yeah, so you transit from being a prosecutor to a defense attorney.
Yes.
What motivated you to switch your career, and how did it change the perspective of justice system?
Okay, that's another great question. And really it was one case that changed my career direction to go from a prosecutor to a defense attorney. I was prosecuting vehicular homicide cases, which is when someone drives recklessly or drunk and someone is killed, they can be prosecuted for vehicular homicide. And I was prosecuting the driver who had killed a mom of three
Wow.
children. And the laws that existed in New Jersey at the time in 1994 were very different than the laws that exist today. And I explained to the husband about what the dynamics were. We called it death by auto. Death by auto was the name of the statute that
Okay.
the individual will be prosecuted under. And I explained to him that under the law in New Jersey that existed at that time in 1994, the individual that was charged, if they did not have a prior criminal history, the maximum jail time they could get would be 270 days in a county jail facility, not in state prison, but in county jail. Or the judge had the option of giving them community service. Well, he was, as you can imagine, is what he told me, Jim, my wife is dead.
Hmm.
She's been killed. She's been murdered. And it's the same as if a gun was used, a knife were used. Why is it different that a car was used and that this person was driving drunk and driving recklessly? And I said, you have an excellent point. I said, what I will do is I will go to the grand jurors. That's the body that determines the advancement of a case. They determine that a case proceeds in the county system, in our county system in New Jersey. And they indicted for what's called aggravated manslaughter, which was the highest degree possible under the law that we could indict this individual for. It was really a murder, but without a purpose or an intent, recklessly causing a homicide. And we went to trial, and I got to know the husband through the course of this case. It went on for many months, and I got to know him. He was an attorney himself. And he had told me, I'm going to change the laws in New Jersey. And I told him, I don't have that ability, but I think that you have the passion, the energy, and certainly you have the mission to do it, and you should. Well, he petitioned, I think, close to 100,000 citizens throughout the state, and he presented the petitions to state legislatures, and the law was changed. So in New Jersey now, if you drive drunk over the legal limit, or if you drive under the influence of drugs, or you drive in a reckless manner, speeding, and you're charged with vehicular homicide, you now must go to prison for 3 years, mandatory state prison. And the laws were changed in New Jersey as a result of this individual and his efforts. He then started a board, a foundation, to speak to high school students about the dangers of drinking and driving. And tragically, he was jogging by the site where his wife was killed, and he got struck by a car and was killed. So I took his place on the speakers board. We only had 2 people, and I took his place, and I left my job at the prosecutor's office and became a defense attorney. And I spoke to about 75,000 high school students in New Jersey over 2 years about the dangers of drinking and driving and being a passenger with a drunk driver operating the vehicle. And I talked about the case and my prosecution of the case and my involvement with the husband and how he single-handedly changed the laws in New Jersey. And it was very impactful. I spoke to a lot of students, and I hope I touched on some of their lives in some way.
So, as you said, that could be the drug involved into that one. So, related to that, I have one question: that why every state has a different laws for that? So, in Colorado, the drugs are illegal. The drugs are allowed. Why in the different state it is not allowed? Do you think that it is a flaws in the law system?
Well, to answer your question, really, it's never okay. It's never lawful for anybody to smoke marijuana or take drugs and drive, no matter what the drug is. It can be a prescription medication. If you're prescribed a medication by your doctor, you do not, and if it has a warning on it, says do not operate heavy machinery, and you get behind the wheel of a car and you kill someone, you can be held responsible under the law. Now, with the advent of the legalization of marijuana, which is in Colorado, New Jersey, many states now have made it lawful to smoke marijuana recreationally, medicinally, and there still is a problem with this, and that is that people think if it's okay to smoke it, it's okay to drive and smoke. It's the same with drinking.
Right.
Well, if it's okay to have a beer, why isn't it okay to drink and drive? Well, society's finally come around to that and said, it's not okay. It's not okay. And It's a big problem right now. In fact, in law enforcement, we just faced it in New Jersey, and it's called the DRE, a drug recognition expert, and that is a specially trained police officer. Now, Colorado was inundated with DWIs because of marijuana, and they needed to have the resources to train these officers to be recognized experts, so they could give an opinion in court that the person was under the influence of marijuana and it affected or impaired their ability to operate the vehicle. So it's never okay, it's never lawful for someone, even though the state may pass legislation that says marijuana is legal, you still can't drive and smoke smoke pot at the same time. If you're under the influence, it's going to affect or impair your ability to operate a vehicle.
Right. So in your 35 years of experience, do you find any flaws in the system?
Well, yes. And that's from my years of experience. And every state appoints judges or elects judges and prosecutors differently. Now, I don't know what it's like in Colorado, but in New Jersey, they're appointed through the governor.
Okay.
The governor has the ability to appoint prosecutors and judges. So as you can imagine, it becomes a bit partisan, based on party lines. And it's been that way in New Jersey for as long as I know. That's the way it has worked. Other states have elected people being elected, running for office to be a judge or a prosecutor, which I see fundamental flaws with that system. Why? Because you have to raise money to run a campaign. Well, where are you getting your money from? There are some inherent conflicts of interest. If somebody's paying you towards your campaign and somebody in their family gets accused of a crime, you might look the other way, or you might treat that case a little differently. So from my years of experience, I definitely saw a change in our system. Now, whether it was simply because of my role reversal, becoming a defense attorney, I felt that judges wanted so much to believe prosecutors and their cases that my clients seemed to be guilty walking in a courtroom. And that's just not the way it should be. You are innocent until proven guilty. And I felt very much so that that safeguard, that constitutional safeguard that you're innocent until proven guilty, was not always true. I felt that judges wanted so much to believe the prosecutor, and sometimes I felt the fight was unfair. I felt like it was me fighting a judge and a prosecutor rather than just fighting for my client against the prosecuting attorney. I was also fighting with the judge or the court. And when I say fighting, I mean arguing.
So, is there any chance that when you argue with the judge, that he escalates that particular case somehow? Any time had happened?
You mean take it personally?
Yeah.
Yes. Several judges over the years, both he and she, male and female judges that I've encountered, they may not like the way you're arguing a case. They may not like your aggressive nature. They may not like your passion. But that's how I am. That's how I would. That's how I approached my defense of a case. Is I went about it with passion and with advocacy, and I felt very much so. No matter who I represented, that it was like a family member to me. Everybody was like family. I looked at the client that I represented as if it were someone in my family that were accused of a crime, and I would fight for them just like I would fight for my family.
So, do you ever feel that the laws is biased against the races, class, and the background?
That's an interesting question. As much as I try to say no to that, I do feel that the system, I think it has a bit of a prejudice in some way. And I mean that in due respect to the judges that I appeared in front of and the judges that are judging cases. I think in their hearts they try not to, but what happens, unfortunately, is, if you are in a minority community, you may not have adequate means to hire a good, I don't want to say good, competent, capable, because there are public defenders that are really great attorneys. And I dealt with many of them, but they don't get the benefit of hiring an attorney. They don't have the financial resources. So sometimes just the fact that they have a public defender standing next to them puts them in a bit of a difficult position, I think, to treat it a little bit differently. So I'd have to say yes. And you can look at our prison system, for instance, in the United States, we have disproportionately incarcerated African Americans, Latinos in our system. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I've represented people of all walks and colors and creeds and religions over the years. And I did feel when I represented people in that particular group that it was a bit tougher or challenging. I did feel that way, but I did feel like the fact, and I'm not patting myself on the back, but the fact that I was standing next to them at counsel table and I was fighting for them, that I was balancing the scales.
Okay, so I just wanted to discuss the recent case. I'm not sure that you are following that particular case or not, about that Sudiksha Kanoni, that the Indian girl was missing from that beach.
Yes.
So do you have any thoughts on that one, that what is the cause for it? And right now the police already arrested that his boyfriend, or that the boy that he says we hang out. What is your thought on that?
That's an interesting case because I know that the young man, I think the parents of the young woman that drowned,
Right.
now they've requested that the medical examiner or the coroner pronounce her death by drowning. And
The parents ask?
the parents of the young lady.
Oh, okay.
So, and I think that they want very much to have this young man exonerated. In other words, that he is not guilty of committing a criminal offense. And they just brought him in for questioning. And I think the way the law exists in the Dominican Republic, where he was and where this happened, they had a right to hold him for, I believe, 48 hours before initiating charges. And I lost track of the case today. I don't know what's happened today. I don't know if there were any developments, but the last development, I believe yesterday or the day before, the parents specifically asked that they declare this death accidental so that the young man would not be charged. The interesting thing that I found in that case is that there were a lot of people present on the beach going in the water at this time, and I'd be interested to know if these other individuals were interviewed. I'd like to know what they said. I mean, apparently this girl was at the beach with this young man, but there were a lot of people around, and they were going in and out of the water. And I certainly would like to know. There's got to be more to the story. That's my opinion. I really feel. But do I feel that he killed her? I don't think the evidence right now supports that, from what I know, and I have very limited knowledge about the case, though.
Yeah, unless and until that there is no evidence, that no one can prove he's guilty. Definitely.
Right, unless someone says that they saw him go in the water and hold this girl down, or they were struggling in the water and he was not letting her get air. That's different. That's a different case completely.
Yeah, I totally agree. So in your career, how did the pressure of handling the sensitive cases like the sex crime or the homicides, what is the fairness of justice do you find in that particular cases?
Well, the more serious the charges or the offenses for either the cases that I prosecuted or the people that I defended and represented as the accused that were alleged to have committed crimes, and whether or not they ultimately pled guilty or they were found guilty by a jury, I feel like the system really looks at those people involved in those cases and treats them much more, I don't want to say seriously, that's not the word that I'm looking for, but they certainly treat them differently.
Okay.
They're given a lot more attention, those cases, which they should be, quite frankly. If they're serious crimes or offenses, they should be viewed a little bit differently. But sometimes I feel that the same rights that you might have in a case that might not be as significant are not being respected in those cases where the charges are much more significant, like a sex crime or a homicide case.
Okay. So suppose if there are any rape cases happening, do you feel that any cases in your career or throughout your law system as far as how longest the case will end up, like how many years, or it it finished very quickly with the verdict?
Well, that's an interesting question because some of the cases take longer than others to go to trial. Some cases, for many reasons, take time to gather evidence from the prosecution. They need to interview witnesses. They need to gather physical evidence. Um, those cases tend to take more time, especially if they're significant charges or serious charges. From the defense point of view, you want your client to have their day in court as quickly as possible because I agree. There's an old expression, justice delayed is justice denied.
Right.
So, the longer you have to wait to get your day in court, the harder it is, especially if you're incarcerated. If you're incarcerated waiting for your day in court, you can imagine what that's like. Your freedom is being taken away from you, your liberties being taken away from you, and you have no choice. You need to wait, and you're really I don't want to say you're a victim, but you have to be subject to the system at that point. You have to wait until your day in court, until the court says it's okay and the prosecutor says it's okay. And that was a battle I often faced as a defense attorney was, we're ready to go. We're ready to go. We're ready to challenge this case. We're ready to fight these charges. And I have a client that's in custody in jail, and we want very much to have our day in court. And it didn't always happen like that. So from beginning to end, yeah, it could take a year. And then of course, when the verdict comes in after a jury trial, if your client is guilty, then there's a sentencing. And as a prosecutor, if you had a victory or a verdict in your favor, where someone was found guilty of a charge, they would be sentenced to a significant period of time. Like, for instance, that driver I spoke about that was prosecuted for aggravated manslaughter. He was convicted. The jury found him guilty of aggravated manslaughter, and he got 20 years.
20 years?
20 years, 10 years without parole.
Wow.
And I talk about one case in particular in my book. It's a chapter that I devoted to one case. It's the name of the chapter is The Killing of MM and Death by Prison.
Okay.
And the case involved a young woman who was leaving a health club, and she was abducted, robbed, and raped, sexually assaulted.
Oh my God.
And the perpetrator, and I prosecuted this case, the perpetrator of the offense was a homeless man. He lived in the woods in a van, and he robbed this woman, and it was really all circumstantial, and he raped her, and he removed her from that site, so he abducted her. And we went to trial, and it was all circumstantial evidence, very powerful circumstantial evidence. Ultimately, he was found guilty. Well, the judge originally gave him 60 years, 30 years without parole. And ultimately that sentence was appealed, and it was reduced to 40 years, 20 years without parole. So he was sentenced to 40 years. Well, that perpetrator, the same individual that committed these horrible offenses, he went to prison, and within 6 months, I believe he was killed. He was beaten to death in the prison system.
Oh my God.
And when I say it was the killing of MM and death by prison, MM was the victim in the case, the young woman that was coming out of the health club. She was traumatized by these events, and she never really got over it. And she became addicted to drugs and ultimately died of a drug overdose several years later. So there were, in my opinion, 2 people that died in that case. And senselessly, MM, I got to know her after the case, and she was a very nice young lady, and I felt terrible for her and her family over her loss. It was very tragic.
So in your career, do you have any cases that that person is innocent, but still that he feel guilty and he was in a jail, he or she, whatever?
Yeah. Later on in my career, that happened a little bit too often. One case in particular I talk about in the book as a defense attorney.
And that you won the case, or
Well, it's an interesting story because I represented this young man who was accused of a date rape.
Oh, okay.
He was a college student, and the young lady was entering college, and they had known each other for a long time. And she claimed that she was too drunk to give consent. She said, I had too much to drink, and therefore he forced himself on me, and he had sexual relations with me against my wishes, against my will, without my consent. That's what the law says, consent. It wasn't consensual. So I represented this young man, and I got to know him. His dad was a surgeon, and he said, "Look, she said yes. She said yes." Well, he was incarcerated for these charges. Okay. And I looked at the investigation, and the investigation was done, I'll say, shoddy. There were a lot of mistakes that were made, and I was looking at it as a former prosecutor. If I had to prove this case, how would I prove it? And I was looking at the investigation. It was very flawed. There were many problems that were done that were committed through the police and the detectives, and there were a lot of them that I could certainly mention. But the long story short is that I fought very hard to get this young man out. I felt that he was being wrongfully accused of this, and I think he deserved his day in court, and he wanted his day in court to say, "I'm not guilty." And it took forever for that to happen. I fought very hard for him. I went to court probably a half a dozen times, and each time I tried to fight to get him out and released, the judge denied it. So we ultimately went to a higher court, an appellate court. We fought it, we took an appeal, and the appellate court upheld the decision of the lower court. In other words, they said the judge didn't make any mistakes. He was properly detained. Well, the family was very disappointed with the system, the way it was working.
Right.
And I guess I was a representative of the system because I was fighting for their son. And ultimately they came to me and they said, "Look, it's nothing personal, but we think we need to get another lawyer." And I said, "That's your right. You have a right to do that." And they paid a substantial amount of money to another attorney. I gave him my physical file, literally took my file with all my notes, everything, and sat down with that other attorney for an hour and explained all the nuances of the case. And ultimately, I found out the young woman that was involved in this case that accused him of this rape was involved in selling her, basically doing an OnlyFans site. I don't know how many people know about that, but I guess you disrobe and you get paid. If you display your body parts, you get paid. Well, I tried to present that to the prosecutor and said, "Look, this case, she's not really that credible because she's doing these crazy things. And I don't mean to be bashing the victim in the case. That's not what I'm about. But this has to come up at some point. You need to investigate this." Well, later on, she became an escort. She became a prostitute. Okay. And look, that's illegal where she was doing it. It wasn't in Las Vegas. It was illegal in the state where she was doing it. And ultimately, this was after a year, more than a year. This young man was in jail for over a year, waiting for his day in court. And I was no longer his attorney.
Oh, okay.
The young lady had an encounter with a married man, and she threatened to tell his wife, and he attacked her, and she stabbed him several times.
She stabbed him?
She stabbed him.
Wow.
And after she stabbed him, the prosecutor dropped the case and the young man was freed. But he spent over a year in jail.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Really
so, that was clearly a case of unequal justice, in my opinion.
Yeah. So in your career that you already that handled the wealthy. So do you think, as your perspective, that justice system treat the wealthy and the poor defendant equally?
Interesting that you make that, or you ask that question, because I was a private defense attorney, so people would come to me and pay me for my services, and I had a price, depending upon the case and the stages of the proceedings. you have to put a dollar amount to that. That's what we do as defense attorneys if you're in private practice. And at some point you have to be able to say, hey, this is what I charge, and that's it. I can't, it's not like you can negotiate every case, how much you're going to take. I felt that as a private defense attorney, there was almost a disadvantage to some extent. And what I mean by that is, if you dealt in the same courts with the same prosecutors representing the state over and over, and you were a worthy adversary, let's say you were an aggressive adversary, you were passionate about the case and you fought the case, and they knew you fought the cases, well, they could engage in this system of bringing you to court unnecessarily and wasting a lot of time and really depleting the retainer.
Okay.
So that your client would run out of money. Ultimately, you would have to ask the court to be relieved if your client could not continue to pay you, which happens so often because the cost of justice became so expensive. To get your day in court and have a jury trial became exorbitant.
Yeah, exactly. So
exorbitant.
People...
And prosecutors knew that. So if they wanted you to get out of the case, you would be in a revolving door, and you'd have to keep going back to court and saying, Judge, we've been here, we've done that. When is the case going to be ready?
Right. So there will be no any way the people who doesn't have enough money to hire any prosecutor or the attorney?
Well, that's what the Office of the Public Defender is designed for. Now, like attorneys, there are good public defenders and there are not so good public defenders. So not every one of the public defenders is going to be someone that you want fighting your case in a courtroom. Maybe they're really good at negotiating, but maybe they're not great trial attorneys. So, that certainly, everybody has that available to them. A public defender is available to anyone that cannot afford the services of an attorney. Of course, you have to qualify. You have to go through the legal standards based upon whether you have income, whether you own a home, whether you own property, things like that. But ultimately, the decisions are made that you qualify for a public defender, and then you get represented by the public defender instead of a private attorney. And now a lot of people might say, well, a public defender is not really a real lawyer because they're given to me. Well, no, that's not true. They're just as good a lawyer as a private attorney.
Okay. So apart from the law system, that if any police officer pull over you, so what are the steps or what are the advice that you can give the people? What should they do and what are their rights?
Okay, well, there's several layers to that question.
Yeah.
If you're being pulled over for a traffic stop, if you went through a red light or you were speeding, my advice to anyone is to cooperate, to be respectful to the police and cooperative with the police because they're doing their job, that situation unfortunately can unravel very quickly. It can get very bad very quick. People get aggressive with the police. They question why they were pulled over. Why are you harassing me? Or why did you stop me? And I've always felt that the best way to handle a situation like that is just to be cooperative. License, registration, insurance. Officer, if I can ask you, why was I pulled over? I must have done something wrong, or you wouldn't have pulled me over. Once you make that acknowledgement, I think it calms the situation down. I really believe that 99% of the police officers are out there doing their job and they're doing the best they can do, and they don't want a confrontation with someone, and they want it to be a good experience for everybody. It's even if they're going to give you a ticket, that's one situation. Now, if you're charged with something more significant, if you have a gun on your seat and you had committed a crime and you're being stopped by the police as a suspect because they have information that you're a person of interest, well, my advice to anyone would be to assert your constitutional rights, and that is to not make any statements. That's just, that's fundamental. not to incriminate yourself, not to make any statements that might incriminate yourself. But my advice is always the same: to be cooperative and to be respectful. And I think that goes a long way. And I value and respect law enforcement. Even as a defense attorney, I respected and valued their role in a case. Whether I agreed they did their job correctly, that's something else different. Or, if I had them on the stand and I was cross-examining them, I might have looked at some of the mistakes that they made, and I might be highlighting them. But that was my job. I felt that was my job. And after they got off the stand, I would go over and I would say, look, I hope you don't think this was personal at all. I didn't want to attack you on a personal level. I certainly wouldn't do that. That's just not what I was there to do. I was there to protect the interests and the rights of my client.
Right. So in recent year, we already seen there are some political influences happening, right? So from your perspective, do you think the justice system has increased the challenging in maintaining it?
Well, that's a big issue. The politicalization of our justice system has become much more a subject of discussion and much more in the news now than it ever has been. And that was, I can't say it wasn't always there, but now it's highlighted and we see it highlighted, and I can go back to the previous administration and say there was a politicalization of the Department of Justice and they were going after Donald Trump. And I looked at it like, I don't care if he's Donald Trump or he's Donald Duck, we're all the same, we're all guaranteed protections. And when I see a court or a judge that should have recused themselves, in other words, if they have some interest in the case or the outcome of the case, it's their responsibility and their obligation to come forward and say, I can't handle this case. It should go to someone else. Or if you have a DA that campaigns on, I'm going to prosecute this man. For what? So we find a crime and we prosecute him. Now, I see what's happening today, and I'm not in favor of what's going on, that now we're using the court system as a way to try to impede the system from working. And you may agree or disagree, and I try not to take sides, but unfortunately I do have a side. I think that unfortunately we need to respect and understand that there's a system in our country that exists, and we have a balance of power. We have three branches of government, and this needs to be explained on a fundamental level to people. We have a legislative branch, we have a judiciary branch, and we have an executive branch. And the executive branch is the president, and he has a right to, use the laws that are on the books and to use his executive power to exercise those powers. It's not a judge's place to try to stop a plane filled with, illegal criminals, returning them back to their home country that are in the country illegally. That's not the judge's job. And that decision will be turned around in a second. I have no doubt about that. When I sit and I look at some of these cases as an attorney and I look at it from both sides, is the system treating the individual fairly? Is this a case that belongs in that court? And I know people would disagree with me on these points, but my resounding answer in these situations is the court has no involvement in this. They should not be trying to shut down the president's operations by, if there's fraud, waste, and abuse in our government, then that's the president's job to eliminate that. It's not the court's place to say, no, you can't do that. You can't fire people from their jobs.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think that is the function of the court, and I don't think that that's going to be upheld. At some point, it's going to make its way through the courts, and ultimately the Supreme Court will have to say this is not the place of the courts to be involved. And also, the weaponization of the Department of Justice, which we saw under the last administration, these were baseless prosecutions, in my opinion. And you see how they all fell apart. They really were much to do about nothing. And if you think about the time and the energy and the resources, now I look at this as a taxpayer. Do I want my money as a taxpayer being used to spend going after this person? Do I want to pay that prosecutor to prosecute a senseless case? I could talk about this all day long. I mean, we went to Georgia, the prosecutor, Fannie Willis, hired her boyfriend to prosecute the case against Donald Trump. She paid him $600,000.
Wow.
If there's not something wrong with that, that's just common sense. That's not me being partisan. I don't care if I'm a Democrat or Republican. I don't want the DA hiring her boyfriend, paying him $600,000, which was 6 times more than the highest paid prosecutor in her office. Where does he? And he never had prosecuted a case. He had no criminal experience.
Agree.
Why is he getting $600,000? She couldn't explain that. So it was just a corrupt. The system can be corrupt or it can be not corrupt. We need to take away the obvious corruption. Unfortunately, that's happening all too often. It's making it harder and harder for people to respect the court system.
So do you agree with that Donald Trump decision about the citizenship after the birth?
That's a good question. I'm not an immigration attorney, but I see the basis for which he's saying, look, just because you're born in the U.S. doesn't guarantee you a right of citizenship. I understand that. Whether I agree or disagree with that, that's really not the issue. I think what he's trying to say is that does not guarantee you citizenship. And, he's going back in time and really, people are going to have to start studying their history because this is based on a case, the Dred Scott decision, which was decided in, I want to say it was 1873 by our Supreme Court, which said that African Americans were 3/5 of a person. And somehow that case decision was applied to his argument that these people are not guaranteed citizenship just because they come into the country illegally and or their parents are coming illegally and they're born here doesn't guarantee them citizenship. That's a whole issue that, quite frankly, that's going to have to be decided. And I don't know how I feel about that, quite frankly. My grandparents came to this country as immigrants. And, my grandfather, God rest his soul, came to this country in 1921.
Okay.
And he came with 2 suitcases and $10,
Wow.
and he sent for my grandmother 5 years later, who is still in Italy, and they were married before he left to come to this country, to the United States. And he worked for those 5 years. And my mom was born in 1927, and she's still alive today. She's 98 years old, going to be 98.
Oh my God.
So, but my mom spoke Italian growing up, and she was sent home from school because she couldn't speak English.
Oh, okay.
I could not imagine that happening today, that someone would be sent home from school because they couldn't speak the language.
Yeah.
And she couldn't start school until she could speak English. And as a result of that, I never learned Italian, which I kind of, this is an aside, but I never learned Italian because my mother would not let my grandparents speak Italian to me, although they did. And I picked up a lot of Italian. I never learned to speak Italian because my mother forbid it, because she knew how hard her life was speaking Italian, and she didn't want her children to have to go through those same things. But that doesn't happen today. When people come to this country, they don't give up their culture.
Definitely.
And they're entitled to keep their culture. You should be allowed to do that. That's what makes America America. It was what makes us a great country.
Yeah, exactly.
People from all different countries come here and we assimilate. We get along. We have friends that are of every different, it doesn't matter. And we get to experience the cultures and go into restaurants and, whether it's an Indian restaurant or an Italian restaurant, it's, we get the benefit of that, and we get to meet people and experience their cultures through them. It's a great thing.
Yeah, exactly. Even I believe that even though that I have a citizenship and being an Indian, then I'm really stubborn with my culture and my values. That the same thing that I want to transfer to my girl.
Yes, of course. And you should. And it's important.
Yeah, exactly. So the last question, that if you want to change anything in the law system, what would be and why?
Wow. Well, one of the things I talked about earlier really was the judges need to recognize if there's a potential conflict in a case.
Oh, okay.
if they see that conflict arising, coming up, where they're going to be on one side or the other side, they feel strongly for one side versus the other side, they probably shouldn't be involved in that case. That is something that I think we need to evaluate. And I think too much of that is going on today, where judges need to take a step back and have a clear conscience, going into the case, that they can be fair, they can be impartial. That's what a judge's job is. Fundamentally, be detached from the case, the facts of the case, the charges in the case. Be neutral, be impartial. That's what a good judge does. And the job of a prosecutor, which unfortunately needs to be reminded, is not about getting convictions. It's about doing justice. And sometimes doing justice means dismissing charges against someone. And that, unfortunately, it has become a foreign language to say the word dismissal. I experienced it many times, but I had to convince the prosecutor that they had no case, that my client truly was innocent. And that's not the way our system is designed. Our system is designed the other way around. The prosecution must prove that you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not the job of the defense attorney to do the investigation of the prosecutor and say, my client wasn't there and didn't commit this offense. I had that happen many times, and thankfully I got prosecutors to agree to dismiss cases against my clients. Okay. But it was a lot of work. It wasn't easy.
Yeah, exactly. Agree. I think that's why that the law has a blindfolded.
That's right. But, as you can see, the blindfold, she's peeking out from underneath the blindfold, which means she's got her finger on the scale, which means she's tipping the scale one way or the other way.
Exactly.
That's not the way it's supposed to be in our system. It should be blindfolded and the scales being equal.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so it's a last thing. It's a rapid fire round. I ask you some questions. That's a one-word answer that you need to give.
Okay.
So justice or fairness? Justice or fairness?
Justice.
Prosecution or defense?
That's a tough one. That's tough. I enjoyed both. I'll say defense.
Experience or education?
Experience.
Truth or strategy?
Strategy as a good lawyer.
Courtroom or classroom?
Now it's classroom. It used to be courtroom.
Power or responsibility?
Responsibility.
Innocent or guilty?
Innocent.
Punishment or rehabilitation?
That depends. I don't know if I can answer that one. That's a tough one. That's really tough. Now, if you said juveniles, I would say rehabilitation, because that's the whole point of the juvenile system is rehabilitation, not punishment.
Conviction or acquittal?
As a good defense attorney, acquittal is the word I always look for.
Okay. Trust or doubt?
Trust.
Law or ethics?
Ethics.
Past or future?
Future.
Reform or abolition?
Reform.
Hope or fear?
Hope.
That's it.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I feel like, and I do teach in a law school, and I'm very optimistic. I have seen very good young students coming out, and I think that they're optimistic, and I think that their heart is in the right place. And I feel that that gives me optimism. That gives me hope that there will be changes made. And, maybe we won't be in this same system we are today 10 years from now. I do look at my role as being a bit of a dinosaur, I have to say. Being a trial attorney, I think, there's a certain art to trying a case and being in front of a jury and having the ability to speak to people and convince them of your position. And I think that, unfortunately, in today's society, with the technology, people stare at their phones so much, they don't connect. They don't have the ability to connect and look at people in their eyes and speak to them on that level. And I think that's important.
So, what is the one advice that you want to give to all new lawyers?
My advice would be that, there's so much advice I could give, but
Definitely,
um,
you have lots of experience.
yeah, I really say that find your passion. There's so many areas of law, and I tell my students this.
Hmm.
You don't have to be a litigator. You don't have to be in a courtroom to be a lawyer. There are so many different things you can do and so many different hats you can wear as a lawyer. And I teach the class persuasion and advocacy. And what I tell my students is you don't ever have to use this in a courtroom. Persuasion and advocacy is what life is about. It's having the ability to connect with people and speak to them and convince them. That's really what life is about. You might have an argument with someone, but you want them to understand why you feel the way you feel. You
Correct.
know, maybe they don't agree with you. Nobody has to. Not everybody's going to agree about everything, but if you understand why they feel the way they feel, and you tell them why you feel the way you feel, and you can walk away from each other still being friends, that's the best you're going to do. So I tell my class that. I say, look, tell the students, you don't have to go into a courtroom. Just apply this in life. Persuasion and advocacy.
Yeah.
You're always going to have to persuade somebody, and you're always going to have to, if you adopt this role as an attorney, you're an advocate. You can be an advocate without being an attorney. So, I just say you can apply this anywhere. You don't need to take it into a courtroom.
Yeah, exactly. The life will teach you everything, not even the classroom or the courtroom.
Right, right. Well, I think I learned so much more, um, dealing with people, representing crime victims, representing people whose families were ripped to shreds. I mean, having a daughter murdered,
Yeah.
or having your son and daughter killed by a drunk driver. These are impactful things, and I developed a emotional attachment in some ways to these people and their situations. And I think that's part of it, quite frankly. To be a good, effective attorney, you do have to have that emotion. You have to be emotional. I think you have to not wear it on your sleeve. I don't mean to go around crying and being
Yeah.
upset, but you do have to
At least empathy that everyone should have.
empathy. Correct. That's the best word. Empathy.
Yeah.
Yeah. To be have that empathy and be respectful of people's feelings, and to feel the way they can feel and understand how they feel.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, James, for have a wonderful conversation, and thank you
It
for
was great.
yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.